In 2011, when she was just 10 months old, our daughter was diagnosed with leukemia. I will never forget the horror and despair in that moment. So quickly, all of the fears and worries and little concerns that we had as parents up until that point vanished. We felt distressed and we felt terrified. But the truth is, there was precious little time for us to make sense of the situation because our daughter Paige started chemotherapy the very next day. And so began 114 weeks of treatment that would severely test her physical strength again and again and again. It would also test our bonds as a family. And yes, it would change our outlook on life forever. And yet, this is not just a story of how a young child fought and beat a fearsome illness, as compelling as that might be. This is also a story of how my wife, Lisa, saved our daughter's life. Twice, through her unyielding determination to do whatever she thought was best for her child. I believe that we have an important role to play in the clinical decisions that impact the care of our loved ones. Even if you are not a doctor, everyone in this room has the power to save a life. And over the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to show you how. But let me start by taking you back 10 years. My family and I were on holiday in the Caribbean when Paige, 9 and a bit months old, got sick for the very first time. Very, very high temperatures, and we took her to the local doctors, and they couldn't find anything wrong, but they started her on antibiotics, and the fevers broke after a few days. Happy. She went back to smiling again. But before we left the country, a senior doctor on her case took my wife aside, and said that she wasn't really sure with what she was seeing in Paige's blood results under the microscope. She didn't know what was wrong, but she urged us, when we got back to the UK, to get a follow-up blood test. Of course, by the time we got home, Paige is fine, she's happy, she's laughing. Lisa takes her to the doctor, and the doctor's perhaps understandably hesitant to stick a needle in a happy, healthy 10-month-old girl. But Lisa stands firm and insists on having that blood test. Within hours, Paige was at the Children's Cancer Ward in Southampton receiving an emergency blood transfusion. Because even though there were no outward signs of leukemia, her blood had already become so thick that they told us later she was maybe hours away from going into multiple organ failure. If Lisa hadn't stood her ground in the doctor's office, if she hadn't insisted on the blood test on that day at that time, Paige might not have made it through the night. That was the first time that Lisa saved Paige's life. After 4 or 5 weeks of intense chemotherapy, we were able to take Paige home from the hospital. But because of the chemotherapy, she had almost no natural immunity to fight the kind of infections that everyone in this room shrugs off on a daily, weekly basis, which meant that if she had even the slightest temperature, she had to be rushed to the hospital, started on a course of antibiotics for at least 48 hours. We also had to be ruthless with the guests that were coming into our house. No one could come if they had a temperature, if they were coughing, if they were sneezing. They had to wash and sanitize their hands when they came through the door. I can tell you, we were well prepared for this pandemic. Most of the treatment, fortunately, in between the intensive chemotherapies, took place at home. And we were trained to administer the milder medicines. And it's a wonderful service from the NHS. A community nursing team can come to your house and take blood, so you don't have to go to the hospital. One day, after the nurses had come and taken blood, we noticed almost immediately that Paige started to look unwell. She was floppy and unresponsive, but there was no temperature. Unsure of what to do, we called the hospital. And the nurse on the phone said, "The blood test doesn't take very long to come back with the results. Let's wait and see." But Lisa was not happy with the way that Paige looked. Once again, she went against medical advice. We bundled Paige into the car and took her straight to the hospital. She did indeed have a very serious bacterial infection. She was put in a high-dependency room. They told us that she was perhaps minutes away from going into septic shock. Now, that's something that they can manage in a hospital setting, but if it were to happen at home, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Paige finished her treatment in 2013 and was cancer-free for 6 glorious years. And in that time, we went on some wonderful family holidays, back to the Caribbean, over to Europe, to the US. We even went to the Isle of Wight. Now, we were incredibly lucky. We managed to catch the leukemia just in time. Many other families have not been so lucky. The type of leukemia that Paige had is called acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and around 1 in 2,000 children under 15 in the UK develop it. Fortunately, around 90% of those children survive. It is a treatable disease, but you have to catch it in time. But you can't diagnose leukemia, or indeed other types of cancers, without looking at the blood under a microscope. So you need to take blood. But as we've learned, doctors don't take blood the minute you walk through their door. They need to have a suspicion. Now, these symptoms of leukemia, fatigue, fever, dizziness, these are common to many other conditions, illnesses, some of them quite normal, quite benign, doesn't matter. So it's not necessarily the case that one or more of these symptoms in a child would immediately lead the doctors to suspect cancer or leukemia. And this can lead to late diagnosis or misdiagnosis. Now, tragedies from misdiagnosis are not uncommon in the UK and in health systems around the world. In a sense, it's kind of unsurprising because doctors are, after all, only human. Some diseases can be difficult to diagnose and pick up. But just as importantly, doctors are often dealing with incomplete information. If it were your child or loved one who had tragically died because of a misdiagnosis, you'd want to know how the system can be improved. And the fact is, there are many improvements we can make to the system, but today I'd like to focus on what we can do, those of us who are not doctors, just through our human-to-human connections. Based on the advice that we've received from doctors and nurses over the years, I believe that part of the solution to making diagnoses more timely lies in all of us taking action at the right time. So when should you take action? To help you to know when, I've developed a model. If your child is sick and you find yourself in the hospital, remember these 3 words: ask, challenge, and talk. Number 1, ask as many questions as you need to in order to make sense of this new and complicated situation you find yourself in. And we might be hesitant to ask questions of doctors and nurses because we've already asked 4 or 5 and we don't want to be a bother. Don't think that. It's in their interest that you understand the situation completely so that you can be engaged and involved in the care. Secondly, please don't be afraid to challenge decisions that are made that impact the clinical care of your loved ones if you don't believe it's in their best interest. Challenge those decisions no matter who made them, whether it's a doctor or a nurse, even a professor, and make sure you, in the very least, get a response to your question, to your challenge. Finally, talk. Talk to doctors and nurses. You know, your friends and family don't know what to say to you when these things happen. So reach out to them. Start the conversation first. Talk to people from charities. Talk to complete strangers if they've gone through the same situation. Because it's through talking that we're able to make sense of the new situation and cope with it. If you are worried or concerned, act. Being in hospital with a sick child can be very intimidating. You can feel powerless and vulnerable. And so this model is not about heaping yet more pressure on you at that vulnerable time. Instead, it's about encouraging you to ask the questions that, let's face it, are already on the tip of your tongue. It's about empowering those of you who might be hesitant to question people in authority. It's about encouraging you to be involved in those clinical decisions even though you have no medical background. Now, I'm not asking you to try and be doctors. Doctors have qualifications and training and experience. They are the experts. But what I've also realized is that we see our children day in and day out, which means that we are experts in their behavior. And we are best placed to spot changes in behavior that might be relevant symptoms. That's why parental concern is now an important factor for doctors to consider before making the referral for cancer care. Ladies and gentlemen, it takes our knowledge of the patient's behavior, combined with the doctor's qualification and experience, to make an accurate and timely diagnosis, and maybe to save a life. In 2019, our daughter Paige got ill again. Mystery illness. She had jaundiced eyes, and her liver started to get enlarged. No one knew what was wrong. But eventually she got so ill that she was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit in the University Hospital in Southampton down the road. In spite of all of the hours and times we'd been in the hospital over many years, this was a new and unwelcome experience for us. She was transferred to King's College Hospital the very next day because they are the liver specialists in this country, but they could find nothing wrong with her liver. Throughout this difficult time, my wife and I continued to ask and challenge and talk. We continued to be tireless advocates for our daughter. After a month and with input from doctors in Southampton, King's College Hospital and Great Ormond Street hospitals, they were finally able to make a diagnosis. The leukemia had indeed come back. Nothing about this illness was usual this time around. Frankly, it's unusual for a patient like Paige with a leukemia she had to relapse after 6 years. You get to 5 years, you do a dance, you have a celebration, and we did. 6 years, not so much. It's unusual for it to attack the liver and for her to, in the way that it did. And because she'd been in the ICU for the best part of 4 or 5 weeks, none of the standard protocols could be used. She was transferred to Great Ormond Street Hospital and they had to come out with a tailored protocol just for her. And we had to hope. And it was successful. The first part, anyway. Paige went from being sedated in the ICU to walking around in 4 or 5 weeks. The doctors were astonished. They would come in the room every day, marveling at the progress she'd made. But her best hope for a cure was a bone marrow transplant. Luckily, her brother was a 100% match for this bone marrow. Great. But because of all the complications and things that had happened, her chances of success were still only around 60%. We were optimistic. In January 2020, after a final 2 weeks of intense chemotherapy and radiotherapy, Paige had a bone marrow transplant. It's such a simple procedure in the end. It looks and feels just like a blood transfusion, of which she's had countless over the years. She was laughing and smiling. We took pictures, hugged the nurses and the doctors. But a few days afterwards and a few weeks afterwards, the pre-radiation and chemotherapy started to take its toll on her physical health. The first thing to go was her mouth, and it was so painful that she couldn't eat. And she was tired and spent most of her time in bed. But you know what? Even through that really uncomfortable period, Paige managed to keep her personality, her smile, her laughter. She continued to display the kindness that we knew our daughter to be. She did so much art and craft that the play specialists couldn't keep up. She would make bead bracelets with the names of the nurses and give it to the nurses and the doctors. This is while she's feeling really rubbish. She even did some school. She played musical instruments with a music therapist. And all the results were going in the right direction. A month after the transplant, they took a sample of Paige's bone marrow, looked at it under the microscope, and there was no leukemia. She had beaten leukemia for the second time. Unfortunately, the complications from a bone marrow transplant are not uncommon, or also because of the radiotherapy and the chemotherapy beforehand. Paige developed something called idiopathic pneumonitis, which is a big word for pneumonia, but a pneumonia where there isn't an underlying cause. They treated it with a high dose of steroids. But pretty soon she needed to go back into the ICU for the 4th time in a year to be put on a ventilator. Now, we remained optimistic. Paige was a fighter. She'd beaten worse challenges than this before. She'd confounded the doctors with her recovery again and again, and she'd beaten cancer for the 2nd time. But after 7 days, we had to accept what the doctors were telling us, which was that the treatment was doing more harm than good. On the 14th of March, 2020, 3 months away from her 10th birthday, the doctors turned off the machines and we said goodbye to our daughter forever. Throughout the most unimaginably uncomfortable treatment and circumstances, Paige kept her optimism and her bravery. We never talked about death. We never talked about failure. She just kept pushing on day after day, sticking to the plan, almost without complaint. And I hope that her bravery and optimism can be an inspiration for other kids who find themselves in difficult treatments. Sometimes I wonder what our lives would be like if Lisa hadn't insisted on that blood test 10 years ago. We would have missed out on 9 years of Paige's life and the love and the laughter that she brought to us. But you know what? We would also have to live with the guilt and despair of knowing that we didn't do everything that was within our power to try and save her. There have been some dark days for our family over the last 18 months, but at least we know that we did everything that we could. And we are certain that the doctors did everything that they could. And that knowledge has provided a certain amount of relief from the pain and grief. Which brings me back to the theme of my talk, how to save a life. Sometimes, by asking and challenging and talking, you are able to save the life of the patient. But if the worst should happen, we know that the pain of losing a loved one can have a really negative impact on your mental health. But the knowledge that you did everything in your power to help save them, that can provide some comfort. And in that case, the life you save might be your own. Thank you.